At my stepdad's retirement party, he announced, "From now on, 40% of your salary will support the household. It's only fair." My mom laughed. My sister smirked. I laughed, thinking it was a joke, until he handed me a legal form. I tore it in half and walked out. The next morning, I woke up to 26 missed calls. I, 24M, never thought my stepdad's retirement party would become the night that changed everything. The whole family gathered at their house last Saturday evening. My mom, my older sister, a handful of relatives, and some of his work colleagues. He'd been with the same company for 32 years, and everyone was celebrating his decades of service. The evening started normally enough. Mom had decorated the living room with gold streamers and balloons. My sister helped serve appetizers while I made small talk with his former coworkers. He seemed genuinely happy, reminiscing about projects and telling stories from his early days at the company. For once, the atmosphere felt genuinely warm. Around 9 o'clock, he stood up and tapped his glass with a fork. The room fell quiet as he began what I assumed would be a typical thank you speech. He talked about gratitude, about family support, about new chapters in life. Standard retirement party fare. Then his tone shifted. He looked directly at me and announced that now that he'd be home full-time, it was only fair that I contribute 40% of my salary to support the household expenses. He said it with the same casual confidence he might use to discuss weekend plans. My mom actually laughed and nodded approvingly. My sister smirked from across the room like she'd been expecting this moment. I laughed too, thinking it had to be some kind of elaborate joke. Maybe this was his way of ribbing me about still living at home while I saved money for my own place. The whole room seemed to think it was amusing. But then he reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a folded document. He walked over and handed it to me, explaining that his lawyer friend had helped him draft a formal agreement. The laughter died in my throat as I unfolded the paper and saw my name typed at the bottom, with a signature line waiting for me. The document outlined exactly what he'd just announced. 40% of my gross monthly income would go toward household expenses, effective immediately. It detailed everything from utility contributions to grocery costs, even including a clause about family maintenance fees. The language was dense and official-looking, clearly designed to intimidate. I stared at the paper for several seconds while the room watched expectantly. He started explaining how this was simply the natural progression of our family dynamic, how I needed to step up and take responsibility now that he'd be transitioning into retirement. He spoke about fairness and contribution, about how I'd been taking advantage of their generosity for too long. Something cold settled in my stomach as I realized this wasn't a joke at all. This was a calculated power play, timed perfectly for maximum effect with witnesses present. He'd planned this moment, probably for weeks. Without saying a word, I tore the document in half. Then I tore it again. The pieces fluttered to the floor as I walked toward the front door. Behind me, I could hear him calling my name, his voice shifting from confident to angry. Mom started saying something about disrespect and ingratitude, but I didn't stop to listen. I drove to my friend's apartment and slept on his couch that night, my phone buzzing constantly with calls and texts that I ignored. The next morning, I woke up to 26 missed calls. 18 from my mom, 5 from my sister, and 3 from him. The voicemails ranged from angry to pleading to threatening. Mom's final message informed me that I had until Sunday evening to come home and sign a new copy of the agreement, or I'd be officially kicked out of the house. That's when I decided they'd made a tactical error. See, what my family didn't know was that I'd been quietly saving money for the past 2 years. Not just for an apartment, for something much bigger. I worked in IT for a mid-sized marketing firm, and I'd been developing a client management software in my spare time. 3 months earlier, a competitor had approached me about purchasing the software and hiring me as their lead developer. The offer included a signing bonus that would have covered a house down payment. I turned them down because I felt loyal to my current company and wasn't ready to leave my family yet. But their offer had an expiration date, this coming Friday. Monday morning, I called them back. By Tuesday afternoon, I had a new job with a 40% salary increase and a $15,000 signing bonus. Wednesday, I found a 1-bedroom apartment across town and put down first month's rent plus deposit. Thursday, I arranged for movers to collect my belongings while the family was out. But I wasn't done yet. Friday evening, I showed up at their house right before dinner. Mom answered the door with a mixture of relief and smugness, probably thinking I'd come crawling back to sign their ridiculous agreement. She invited me in like nothing had happened, already launching into a lecture about responsibility and family obligations. I let her finish, then pulled out my own folder. I'd spent Thursday night researching and printing documents. Property tax records showing the house was worth significantly less than they'd always claimed. Utility bills proving that my contributions over the past 3 years had actually exceeded my fair share of household costs. Bank statements showing that Mom had been using my rent money for her shopping habit rather than household expenses like she'd claimed. Most importantly, I had documentation proving that the house still had my grandfather's name on the deed as a co-owner. My grandfather, my mom's father, who'd helped them buy the place 8 years ago but never officially transferred his portion of ownership. The same grandfather who'd always told me I had a place in this family no matter what. I laid out copies of everything on their dining room table while my stepdad stared in silence. Then I explained my proposal. They could keep demanding money from me, but I'd be contacting my grandfather about his ownership stake in their house. I'd also be filing complaints about the fraudulent family maintenance fees they'd been collecting from me, since I'd discovered that money had been going toward my sister's credit card payments, something they'd never disclosed. Alternatively, they could acknowledge that their retirement party stunt had been completely inappropriate, return the money they'd overcharged me in rent, and we could part ways amicably. The room went dead silent. My sister tried to argue that I was being vindictive, but I pointed out that I was simply applying their own logic. If fairness meant contributing proportionally to household expenses, then fairness also meant accurate accounting and honest disclosure about where that money went. My stepdad's face had turned an alarming shade of red. He demanded to know where I'd gotten access to their financial information. I reminded him that he'd been using my laptop to check his banking for the past year, and that browsers save login information. Mom started crying, saying I was trying to destroy the family over a simple misunderstanding. But there hadn't been any misunderstanding. They'd presented me with a legal document and witnesses, clearly intending this to be a binding arrangement. I gave them until Monday to decide. Update 1. Monday came and went without any contact from them. Tuesday morning, I received a text from my sister asking if we could meet for coffee to work things out. I agreed, curious about their next move. She arrived 20 minutes late, looking uncharacteristically nervous. She spent the first 10 minutes trying to convince me that the whole thing had been my stepdad's idea, that she and Mom had just gone along with it to avoid conflict. She claimed they'd never expected me to actually sign the document. I asked her why she'd smirked during his announcement if she'd been uncomfortable with the situation. She couldn't answer that. Then she got to the real reason for the meeting. Apparently, my threat to contact my grandfather had terrified them. Not because of the house ownership issue, but because they'd been telling him that I'd been contributing substantially more money to the household than I actually had been. They'd been inflating my contributions to make themselves look like better providers in his eyes. If I contacted him with the real numbers, their deception would be exposed. She begged me to reconsider, offering to personally pay back the money they'd overcharged me in rent. When I asked where she'd get that money, she admitted that Mom had been paying her credit cards with my rent contributions, just like I'd suspected. I told her I'd think about it and left. That evening, I called my grandfather. Update 2. My grandfather was 91 years old, but sharp as ever. I explained the entire situation, including the documentation I'd found about the house ownership and the money trail. He listened without interrupting, asking only a few clarifying questions. When I finished, he was quiet for almost a full minute. Then he asked me to come visit him Thursday evening. I drove to his assisted living facility wondering what he was thinking. He'd always been fair but stern, the kind of man who believed actions had consequences. He'd helped my mom buy the house because he wanted to ensure his grandchildren had stability, but he'd kept his name on the deed because he didn't entirely trust my stepdad's financial judgment. Turned out his instincts had been correct. He'd been receiving quarterly reports from my mom about household finances, including claims about my contributions that were nearly double what I'd actually been paying. He'd been proud of me for stepping up as a young adult, often bragging to his friends about how responsible and generous his grandson was. Learning that they'd been lying to him for years made him angrier than I'd ever seen him. He asked me what I wanted to happen next. I told him I didn't want to destroy anyone, but I also couldn't let them get away with treating me like an ATM machine. The retirement party stunt had been humiliating and completely inappropriate. He nodded thoughtfully, then asked if I'd be willing to let him handle the situation his way. He promised that whatever he decided would be fair but firm, and that I wouldn't be put in the middle of any family drama. I agreed, mostly because I was exhausted from the whole situation. Update 3. My grandfather moved fast. By Friday afternoon, my mom received a certified letter from his attorney informing her that he was exercising his right as co-owner to conduct a financial audit of the property. The letter also announced that he was considering selling his portion of the house unless certain conditions were met. Those conditions included returning all money fraudulently collected from me under false pretenses, providing a formal written apology for the retirement party incident, and agreeing to mediated family counseling to address the underlying issues that had led to this situation. The letter gave them 72 hours to respond. My phone started ringing within an hour of them receiving the letter, but I'd already decided not to answer any calls from my family until the weekend was over. I wanted them to sit with their choices for a while. Monday morning, my sister showed up at my new apartment. She looked like she hadn't slept all weekend. She handed me an envelope containing a cashier's check for $3,000. Apparently, their calculation of the money they'd overcharged me, along with a handwritten letter of apology from my mom. The apology was surprisingly sincere. Mom admitted that the retirement party announcement had been planned in advance, and that they'd hoped to pressure me into agreeing by doing it publicly. She acknowledged that this had been manipulative and hurtful, and that they'd taken advantage of my willingness to help the family. She also admitted that my contributions had been helping cover my sister's debts, and that this arrangement should have been disclosed from the beginning. My sister delivered her own apology in person, admitting that she'd encouraged the whole scheme because she'd been panicking about her credit card balances. She'd convinced herself that I wouldn't mind contributing more because I was single and had fewer expenses than she did. The whole conversation felt surreal. These were the same people who'd been demanding money from me 2 weeks earlier, now apologizing and offering restitution. But I could tell there was something else. My sister finally admitted what I'd suspected. They were terrified that my grandfather might actually sell his half of the house. At 91, he had more money than he could spend and no particular attachment to maintaining their living situation if they couldn't treat family members with basic respect. The housing market in our area had exploded over the past few years. If he sold his portion to an outside investor, they'd either have to buy him out at current market rates or sell the entire property. Either option would probably force them to relocate to something much smaller and more expensive. I accepted their apology and the check, but I also told my sister that I wasn't ready to pretend everything was normal again. The retirement party hadn't just been about money. It had been about respect and family dynamics that needed serious addressing. She nodded and asked if I'd be willing to participate in the family counseling my grandfather had requested. I said I'd consider it. Update 4. 3 weeks later, we had our first family counseling session. My stepdad had been notably absent from all the apologies and restitution, so I wasn't surprised when he showed up looking resentful and defensive. The counselor was a middle-aged woman who specialized in family financial conflicts. She'd reviewed the basic situation in advance and had each of us write down our perspective before the session started. Reading my stepdad's account was enlightening. He genuinely believed that I'd been taking advantage of their generosity, and that asking for a larger financial contribution was reasonable given that I was an adult with a good job. He saw the legal document as protection for their retirement security, not as manipulation. But he also revealed something I hadn't known. He'd been worried about money for months. His pension wasn't as substantial as he'd expected, and he'd been counting on my continued contributions to maintain their current lifestyle. The retirement party announcement hadn't been about teaching me responsibility. It had been about panic. Mom's account was more honest. She admitted that they'd gotten comfortable depending on my money, and that the thought of losing that income when I eventually moved out had been keeping her awake at night. She'd convinced herself that increasing my contribution was fair because I'd been living like family, while paying tenant rates. My sister's perspective was the most troubling. She genuinely believed that family members should sacrifice for each other without question, and that my resistance to their plan had been selfish. She couldn't understand why I'd been upset about helping cover her credit card payments, since that's what family does. The counselor spent most of the first session helping them understand why their approach had been problematic. She explained concepts like financial boundaries, informed consent, and emotional manipulation in family systems. My stepdad struggled with this feedback the most. He kept insisting that he'd been trying to teach me life lessons, and prepare me for real-world responsibilities. The counselor pointed out that I was already handling real-world responsibilities quite successfully, as evidenced by my new job and independent living situation. By the end of the session, I realized something important. They'd never actually seen me as an adult. Despite being 24 years old with a professional career, they still viewed me as a dependent who needed guidance and structure. The retirement party ultimatum had been their attempt to establish a parent-child dynamic that didn't actually exist. We scheduled follow-up sessions, but I left feeling more resolved than reconciled. Final update. 6 months have passed since the retirement party. The family counseling continued for 2 more months before my stepdad decided he didn't want to participate anymore. Mom and my sister completed the full program, which helped improve our relationship significantly. I never moved back into their house, and I'm glad I didn't. Living independently has been incredibly liberating. The new job has been challenging and rewarding, and I've been able to save money at a rate that would have been impossible under their 40% plan. My relationship with Mom has mostly recovered. She still struggles with respecting my boundaries sometimes, but she's made genuine efforts to treat me like an autonomous adult. We have dinner together every few weeks, and she stopped making comments about my living situation or finances. My sister and I are cordial, but not close. She never fully accepted that her approach to family financial obligations was inappropriate. She's made progress on her credit card debt, but she still seems to think I overreacted to the whole situation. My stepdad and I barely speak. He's still bitter about how everything unfolded, and he blames me for destroying family unity. He's particularly resentful about my grandfather's involvement, which he sees as an unfair escalation. Speaking of my grandfather, he never did sell his portion of the house, but the threat accomplished exactly what he'd intended. My family learned that their actions had consequences, and that treating family members poorly could result in genuine hardship for them. He passed away 4 months ago, leaving his portion of the house to me in his will. I haven't decided what to do with it yet. Part of me thinks I should sell my share to an investor, just to see how they handle the situation they tried to create for me. But mostly, I'm just grateful that he taught me an important lesson about standing up for myself when people try to take advantage of family relationships. The whole experience taught me that sometimes the people who claim to love you are the ones most willing to exploit you. It also taught me that having clear boundaries isn't selfish. It's necessary for maintaining healthy relationships. I don't regret tearing up that document or walking out of the retirement party. Sometimes the only way to change a bad situation is to refuse to participate in it anymore. And I definitely don't regret those 26 missed calls. They marked the beginning of me taking control of my own life.